today I get to talk about everyone's favourite country, Belarus. As everyone knows, Belarus is located in Eastern Europe and is often called Europe's last dictatorship because we tend to forget about Russia. The history of the two countries is really close, and in recent years Alexander Lukashenko has been kind of like an on-again, off-again boyfriend of Putin. Alexander Lukashenko is the fella in charge of Belarus, and he's been the president of Belarus for as long as there's been a president of Belarus. Irish people will probably recognise some parallels in Belarusian history. Belarus, too, for most of its existence, was part of a larger empire or country that tried to wipe out its identity. Belarus was part of the USSR, and years of foreign occupation has led to a decline in the Belarusian language. Nikita Khrushchev said that the sooner we're all speaking Russian, the faster we can build communism back in 1953, and it wasn't until 2014 that Lukashenko delivered his first speech in Belarusian. To this day, only about a quarter of Belarusians speak their native language at home. Anyway, in 2020, massive riots and protests against Lukashenko's government began in Belarus, and in this video I'm going to explain why they happened and what's likely to happen as a result of the unrest in Belarus. Okay, so who is Alexander Lukashenko and why is everyone so mad at him? Before he became a politician, Alexander Lukashenko was a soldier and also managed a farm for the government. During the Soviet era, Lukashenko had a reputation for being a staunch opponent of corruption and served as the chairman of the Anti-Corruption Committee in the Belarusian parliament. After the fall of the Soviet Union, he won the first presidential election. He campaigned on a very pro-Russian platform, and throughout his first term as president forged closer ties with their Russian neighbours. This election seems to have been legitimate. At least, the EU and the US didn't say much about it. After this, though, Lukashenko immediately started reforming the country to be more authoritarian, increasing his own power through a number of referendums that the EU and the US called unfree. Lukashenko's power grabs were also opposed by the Belarusian people. Massive protests were organized against his re-election in 2006, which was generally seen as illegitimate and not a fair election in the West. Lukashenko claimed that the opposition was funded by foreign powers, and that anyone who went to protests would have their necks wrung as one might a duck. Lukashenko further isolated himself from the West over the years, preferring to align himself with Russia and China. In 2020, Lukashenko claimed that he was re-elected as president. The opposition candidate, whose name is probably pronounced Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, claims that she, in fact, won the election with 60 to 70% of the vote, based on places where she claims that the votes were counted properly. She is asked to be recognized as the true head of state of Belarus, but Western governments are calling for a rerun of the election. During the election, a countrywide internet blackout happened. The government claimed that this was in response to a DDoS attack from outside the country. The election spawned the latest in a series of protests against the Lukashenko regime, except this time, these protests are a lot bigger. For instance, approximately 12,000 people have been arrested in Belarus so far during these protests, compared to less than 1,000 at the last major pro-democracy protests in 2017. The protests are still ongoing, and as of time of writing this, are currently in their 8th week. The past 2 months have seen violence, countrywide strikes, cyber attacks, the leaking of the personal information of pro-Lukashenko forces, and the detention of protesters and journalists. Lukashenko and his allies have accused various groups of funding the protests, or of interfering in the sovereignty of Belarus by supporting the protests. Now, so far, I've talked a lot about why the Belarusian people might want to protest against Lukashenko. They protest for democracy, and they protest against the brutality of his anti-protester measures. But I should also include that there are reasons that other countries would want Lukashenko ousted. As I've said before, Lukashenko is notoriously anti-Western. He doesn't have good relations with the EU or the US, which is especially a problem for the EU due to the fact that a lot of Russian gas needs to be piped through Belarus to get to Europe. On top of that, the US has a bit of a reputation for going in and toppling regimes they don't like. I would be a bit surprised if either group were paying people to go out and protest for like 10 schmackos an hour, but I would be wrong to suggest that they have no reason to want to see Lukashenko fall. I would also say, though, that I don't really care. Maybe the protests do have some foreign backing behind them, but the thing is that you can't engineer this massive an amount of protesting. It's estimated that up to 500,000 people were involved in the protests, which is incredible for a country with only 10 million people, of which only 70% live in urban areas where the protesting is mainly taking place. It's completely possible that the EU, the US, and the Belarusian people all have a common enemy in Lukashenko, even if they might not agree on everything else in the world. So, what's going to happen? Well, first of all, I doubt that there is any situation where the EU or the US or NATO put troops in Belarus. It's just not worth it for them. It's expensive and it's bad optics. Interventionism tends to go down better when it's in the Middle East or Africa, where most people know even less about the countries than Belarus, and it's less likely to provoke Russia. For the most part, it looks like it's just down to the Belarusian people to fight for or against Lukashenko. On the other hand, it seems quite possible that Putin might come to Lukashenko's aid. The two dictators have been close in the past, since they're natural allies against the EU. Lukashenko also accused Putin of trying to make Belarus part of Russia in 2020, which isn't something friends normally do, but I digress. Putin did offer military assistance to Lukashenko early on in the protests, so if things continue to go bad, Putin might make another Crimea out of Belarus. Again, on the other hand, the protesters might win. Although it's impossible to know what might happen in such a case, it seems that Tsikhanouskaya would be in the best position to exploit that situation. She has made herself the head of the Coordination Council for the Transfer of Power. This group was set up by herself and her supporters to, as they say, facilitate the democratic transfer of power. Their stated goal is to have another free election. The EU Parliament has acknowledged them as the interim representation of the people demanding democratic change in Belarus, and so if anyone might benefit from regime change, at the moment it looks like it might be Tsikhanouskaya. Most support for Lukashenko in foreign countries generally focuses on the idea that the protests are being funded by foreign groups. A lot of communist groups support Lukashenko, especially since he's anti-Western and has always been very pro-communist and pro-Soviet. The Belarusian economy isn't technically communist, but it is very much left-wing and has at times been described as market socialism, especially by Lukashenko himself. Because of all this, Lukashenko and Belarus do get some measure of support, and communist groups don't want to see Belarus in the hands of a Western puppet or even a Western-friendly president, which has happened in a lot of former Soviet countries. A lot of communists are worried that the protests in Belarus are a color revolution. Color revolution is the name given to a number of revolutions that happened in various states across the world after and towards the end of the Cold War. These revolutions had various aims. Some were successful and some weren't. Some wanted a more democratic country, some wanted their countries to be more closely aligned with the West instead of the Chinese or the Russians. For instance, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia was a protest against communist rule in the country that led to the ousting of the communist government. China and Russia have said that color revolutions are a new method for Western powers to support destabilizing the allies of Russia and China, a way of changing the regime of foreign countries. The extent to which the EU or the US are influencing the protests in Belarus is yet to be seen, but it's not something I'm awfully concerned about, given the reasons I've highlighted above. What's happening right now in Belarus is sad. Nobody should have to fear being locked up or worse for protesting, whether in Belarus or Western countries. The one silver lining seems to be that the Belarusian people are persevering, and even after 2 months of fighting to establish rights for themselves, they're still out there, standing up to a much better armed and better organized force, which, you have to admit, is pretty epic. I hope the Belarusian protesters are able to get the rights that they deserve soon and without more pain. Good luck to Belarus, and thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this, please subscribe, like, or leave a comment.
помню острую браму святую, и воякал на грозных конях.